it is important for Adams to really think of him as the well-rounded man. He's a founder. He's involved in the Declaration of Independence and the War for Independence on the diplomatic side of things. Then he's president, right? And then we have his life in retirement and his role as a family man and as a friend. There's a lot to learn from a biography of John Adams, right? I think John Adams and John Quincy Adams, and then Charles Francis Adams keeping the British out of the American Civil War and helping to prevent them from coming in on the side of the Confederacy. 3 Adamses in a row laid the foundation for the Anglo-American special friendship in the 20th century, because getting Great Britain in the Treaty of Paris to acknowledge our independence and allow us, credit, ending the War of 1812 in a way that prevented acrimony, that was a kind of extraordinary achievement. But then to go back, and the glory for the victory goes to the general in the field.
Yeah. Welcome to Daring Greatly.
Thank you for having me.
I'm really excited about today's episode because we are starting in America, at America's origins, with the Adams family. John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and then, some generations later, Henry Adams. And I want to begin with one of my favorite quotes from John Adams and just have you respond to it and tell me, why on earth don't we have politicians who talk like this today? So the line is that public virtue cannot exist in a nation without private, and public virtue is the only foundation of republics. There must be a positive passion for the public good and the public interest, honor, power, and glory established in the minds of the people, or there can be no republican government nor any real liberty. So what does he mean by public virtue, and why don't people talk in those sweeping terms today about political participation?
Right. It's the idea of the public.
Okay.
And even I think of, when I hear the word public, I think of the 18th century spelling of public, Publick.
CK,
right?
Yeah.
As a really substantial reality.
Okay.
Right? And that John Adams and other 18th century figures, even like George Washington, thought of a public man being someone who is engaged in their family, in the nation, and in the church.
Okay.
And that is a man, what they called in the 18th century, a man of parts.
Okay.
Right? A man who played many parts, many roles in the public, right? And you definitely have the sense in reading the correspondence between John Adams and Abigail Adams that they see their little domestic realm. And again, I think of the word domestic, the way that they spell it in the 18th
Was
century.
it also with a CK at the
exactly,
end? Okay.
So the public and the domestic, right? That the domestic realm is really preparing their children for virtue in the publics that they will perform their life in, the little public of the family, the little public of the church, and the public of the nation, right? And so John Adams is very clear that for him, the public takes priority. And there is sometimes some tension between him and Abigail about, whether domestic virtue is even, as important as public virtue.
Sure.
And I think we see this a little bit in Hamilton's life as well, right? The domestic virtue of fidelity to his wife and the public virtue of not embezzling government funds as our first treasurer, right? And which one he thought was more essential to his lasting reputation. But constantly thinking in those terms, right? How domestic virtue prepares you for public virtue, and then how public virtue creates a realm in which the domestic virtues right, can play out. So John Adams and Abigail Adams are constantly talking about this and thinking about this in their letters.
Now, was that something that was, a common, that distinction between the two and how those two are complementary, was that common to most of the founders, or was that unique just to people of a certain stature or profession, the sense of public duty?
Yeah, I think that the the liberal arts education that most of the founders received. So when we think of the founders across the colonies, something that they all shared in common, whether they were coming from the Puritan New England or from the slaveholding South, one of the things that they had in common was a liberal arts education. So whether it was John Adams up at Harvard, whether it was James Madison going to Princeton, whether it was Thomas Jefferson at William and Mary, or Alexander Hamilton at King's College that would become Columbia College, they were all receiving a liberal arts education, and central to a liberal arts education in the 18th century would have been reading Cicero's book on duties, right? And that's where he really talks about a man who has to balance prudentially the many realms and duties of your life, right? It's on duties plural, because a man has many duties. He has a duty as father, a duty as husband, a duty as vestryman, a duty as head of the militia, duty as a citizen. And so balancing those duties and understanding how they work together is something that would have been a kind of common way of thinking about one's moral life in the 18th century. The idea of being a public man, right, was playing many roles in many different little publics, right? We think of public as there's only one public, right? But they really thought of res publica, the public things, right? And so you're taking care of a number of public things, and those duties and roles overlap, and can pull you in different directions. So thinking about those things, thinking about the complexity of the moral life, they didn't just think in terms of altruism and egoism, right? It was much more complex than that.
Sure. And so with a book like Cicero's on duties, or let's say Cicero's own life, an example, obviously he writes this book to revive, Roman republicanism in a new generation. That kind of shorter term project is not successful. He dies pretty gruesome death, and the empire comes right then. But the book is picked up by early church fathers. Then even St. Thomas More is said to have carried a copy of it in his breast pocket when he went out. At what point does there's presumably some wilderness years, but or maybe it's centuries or millennia. At what point does this sense of Ciceronian Republican kind of virtue come back and re-enter the conversation?
Right. It is definitely an interesting constant from the ancient through the medieval and into the modern world, right? So unlike the revival of interest in Greek models with the Renaissance, the Latin models were always there, right? So it's an interesting thread of continuity. I really love Jeffrey Morrison's book on George Washington's political philosophy. And it's there where I learned that George Washington had a copy of Cicero's On Duties in his library at Mount Vernon. And for a long time, people didn't recognize that he had a copy of Cicero. Because in the Mount Vernon library bibliography, it's listed as Tully's offices. So Marcus Tullius Cicero's De Officiis was listed as Tully's offices. And so nobody really knew what Tully's offices was. It's the 18th century way of saying Cicero's on duties. But it was actually a common moral philosophy textbook throughout the Middle Ages, right, and on in through the Renaissance. And so the colonial colleges were modeled on the medieval universities of Oxford and Cambridge, the University of Edinburgh and St. Andrews in Scotland. Definitely the moral philosophy that James Madison had at Princeton, and that John Adams had at Harvard were directly modeled on the great English and Scottish universities.
Interesting. So he went to Harvard College, and then after that, did he go immediately into diplomatic service, or he practiced law?
He practiced law. Exactly. So he was a traveling lawyer. But I like to emphasize to my students that before he was a lawyer, he was a property owner and a farmer. John Adams grew up in a log cabin, and he built a log cabin on his property that he had inherited both from his own family and from Abigail Adams's family, and that it was a working farm. So the idea that you would become a doctor or a minister or a lawyer in those days, those were seen as honorary professions, right? That you would take an honorarium, right? You would take a fee for your services, but you weren't living off of those services.
Okay.
So you could do them in an honorable way because you were backed by the fact that you had property and a farm.
That was your independence.
Independence, exactly. Some independent living, as they called it in the 18th century. That you had a living, and then on top of your living, right, you had an honorable profession.
Okay.
Right? So he went into law, and Abigail took care of most of the farm workers and keeping the farm going while he was traveling the circuit courts in Massachusetts.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so basically pretty early in the relationship, they were doing their own things, even though they were, he was in the public.
Even during their engagement.
Yeah. Okay.
You could say they had a long distance relationship even before they were married. Yeah.
So this was not a surprise to her when she would be without him for years at a time. Yeah. So what happened at the Boston Massacre, and how did John Adams end up defending the British?
Right. So John Adams is already involved in political rhetoric and political protest from the time of the Stamp Act in 1765, when he wrote the dissertation on canon and feudal law. So he's been following events for quite some time. And I think that you have to kind of see John Adams's response to the Boston Massacre and then the defense of the British soldiers after the Boston Massacre as kind of doubly valenced, right? There's two things going on simultaneously, right? There's the John Adams who wants these young British soldiers to get a fair trial, right? But there's also John Adams, already the constitutional thinker, who wants to prove to the British regime that you can get a fair trial in the judiciary in Massachusetts. He's trying to prevent what ultimately happens, which is the British Parliament shutting down the independent judicial system in Massachusetts and just imposing martial law. So for him, it's an abject lesson, anybody, should be able to see if even these soldiers who carried out the Boston Massacre can get a fair trial, then we have a right to self-government because we can do this, right? And so he's doubly angered by the shutting down of civil government in Massachusetts because he had just given them an example. Extraordinary.
So did others see kind of this double angle at play, or were they upset at him for defending the British, or what was the popular kind of sentiment here?
I think that he was bucking the popular sentiment. And maybe it's a good thing to just get to get that phrase out here in our conversation right off the bat when talking about the Adamses, because the Adamses were not always popular, and bucking popular sentiment. So in some sense, he was trying to foster what the people wanted, through using a means to that end that the people themselves wouldn't understand. And so he saw how important it was constitutionally, right, to show that this branch of government was in good functioning, good working order, right? When maybe the people were so angry, they just really wanted, they didn't want the acquittal of the British soldiers. But he was nevertheless working for their same ends, right? But through different constitutional means, and that kind of thinking outside of the box didn't go over really well with the general populace all the time. And so, as American politics becomes more democratic and less just in the hands of those educated and property owning, liberally educated people, the Adamses become, have much more tension, I think, with the American public.
And before we get into kind of a little bit more of his career, I guess at what point did the more did that shift from the more of the classical republicanism to the more democratic, impulses? At what point precisely did that, or maybe it's not precise, maybe it happened gradually, did that really shift?
Well, it's interesting because I would say that's not really with John Adams. It's more with John Quincy Adams. So it's moving ahead a little bit. But Russell Kirk, in his book, The Conservative Mind, in the section in the chapter on John Quincy Adams, gives a lot of importance to the state constitutional conventions of the 1820s, 1830s, 1840s, leading into the period of Jacksonian democracy, where the property owning requirements for voting are stripped by the states. So you have the federal constitution, but underneath the federal constitution, you have the state constitutions. And so you could say our federal constitutionalists, right, the founding fathers creating a federal constitution, just assumed the state constitutions that had already been written, and those state constitutions had property requirements for voting. And so it's a fundamental change to our regime when the states have state constitutions at the beginning of the period of Jacksonian democracy and get rid of those property requirements for voting.
What percentage of the male population was voting at the time? Do you have an idea? At the time of the
American founding? It probably was still fairly substantial. And that's why it's not actually that controversial to make that shift, because property owning was fairly common at the time. I mean, we're talking about the Americas; they've just been opened up, right?
Yeah, there's
a lot of land, right? And so it's actually the Western states that lead the way in not having any requirements of property, because there was this kind of assumption that, if a man was 20 years old and had no property, by 23, he would own property. So why are you making a distinction between the property owner and the non-property owner when people are acquiring property so easily? Right? So that's happening out West. And then that movement backtracks into the eastern states, into the eastern borders, eastern seaboard states a little bit later. Virginia, North Carolina, New York, eventually sort of following the Western movement. But then, of course, as you move into a more urban population where people aren't owning property, right, then that starts to really affect the character of the regime. Right.
And then his diplomatic career, does that begin shortly after the Boston Massacre? So
he first participates in both the First and Second Continental Congress. And so he is one of the signers of the Declaration of Independence, and then immediately is sent off to Europe in order to get funding for our revolution. Right? So his diplomatic work is really financial work.
Right? So it's post-independence, but before the Constitution.
Right.
Trying
so
to
secure, as soon as they declare independence, they're looking for other nations to recognize their independence and be willing to extend credit to them. And so he first goes to France, and then he goes to the Netherlands. He sends off his son, John Quincy Adams, whose French is excellent at age 10, 13, as translator with the American ambassador to St. Petersburg to the court of the Tsar.
That was when his son was 10, John Quincy, when he sent him to the court of the Tsar.
Yes, exactly, because his French is better than the American ambassador which is they spoke French at the court in Russia.
Was it typical to bring your 10-year-old son along in these diplomatic missions? Or?
I don't know whether it was beforehand, but he brought his two sons on his first voyage, and then realized that while Johnny was doing very well, John Quincy Adams, his younger son Charles was really having a hard time being away from his mother, and so he was actually sent home on his own across the Atlantic. If you can imagine sending your young son on a dangerous voyage during wartime across the Atlantic. Now we wouldn't put a kid on an Amtrak train from Washington, D.C. to New York.
That's right. Well, I actually think the airlines just maybe banned unaccompanied minor, like that may not even be allowed anymore. So different time. But yes, very different time. They were treating them like young adults, before adolescence. What we would consider, an adolescent. So his diplomatic work really begins with the Declaration of Independence, trying to get that independence recognized, and that's crucial for getting credit so that they can fund the army and fund the new government. And he played a role in the drafting of the Declaration of Independence.
He did, yes. And so some of the changes that we see from the Jeffersonian draft to the ultimate Declaration of Independence that we know and love has, I would say, touches of touches of the Presbyterian mind,
Okay.
touches of the Puritan mind. So there isn't just a sense of a kind of deistic God, but there's very direct appeals to God, not just the laws of nature and nature's God, but God as creator, God as supreme judge of the universe, and God as providential.
Okay.
And so those are very important insertions, right, into the Declaration of Independence that kind of expressed more, I would say, the spirit of the actual American public, and not just the minds of peculiar quality, as George Washington refers to Thomas Jefferson's mind. He says some minds might be able to do without God, right? But not everyone's mind can do without God and recognize the laws of nature and nature's God without religious faith. And so that is actually, I think, an important contribution to the Declaration of Independence.
Interesting. And what was his religious upbringing, or what was his faith like?
So he was, obviously in the Puritan community, but a Puritan community that was already starting to move in the direction of Unitarianism. And so those are debates that are going on within the Adams household, and also Abigail Adams's father was a minister.
Okay.
Right? And so, it's the kind of thing of forming a marriage with someone who has your same religious beliefs, but in a time when those religious beliefs are in flux, and trying to find the sort of sweet spot between Harvard was already considered kind of liberal and kind of Unitarian, right? And Abigail Adams's father, who's a minister and father of ministers, was much more conservative religiously. So there's all of these kind of interesting behind the scenes. I think Abigail is stronger in her Christian faith than John Adams, and in the next generation, Louisa Catherine Adams is also stronger in her religious faith than John Quincy Adams.
Okay.
So you do already see a move towards, the woman is holding down the fort for domestic virtue, but also for religious belief.
Yeah. Interesting. And I recall some story where John Adams visited a Catholic church and went to, Latin Mass in Philadelphia. Is that right?
Yes. It's a beautiful passage to read in the letters of John and Abigail Adams. And again, I read it both ways, right? It's this glowing description where he is just so impressed with what, nowadays we call smells and bells, right? He finds the image of the crucifixion with a bleeding Christ, our Savior bleeding for our sins, with his wounds open, and with the beautiful, sweet chanting of the congregation. And he approves of the sermon. He says it's a good, solid, short sermon on the duties of parents towards the moral education of their children.
Okay,
and
there we go.
He thought it was a very sound
tailor-made for
right?
him.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He thought it was perfect. And then at the end, he says it's the whole service, the whole Catholic service seemed to cast such a spell. How did Martin Luther ever break that spell?
Really?
Yeah. So it's this grand finale, right?
Yeah.
So it's this glowing portrait, and then a kind of final dig. Like, how did you ever break that spell? So it's kind of amazing.
Wow.
It's a beautiful passage.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
So then, how does he become vice president under George Washington?
So we have the course of the whole war, and John Adams really spends that time mostly abroad. His wife is holding down the fort while he's at the Continental Congresses, holding down the fort while he's away in France and the Netherlands.
How many years has he gone from Abigail during this period?
Really the full 8 years.
Really?
Yeah,
okay.
Because he's also part of the negotiation of the Treaty of Paris that concludes the war, which, of course, super important aspect of the Treaty of Paris that they negotiated is that Great Britain recognized our independence at the end of our war for independence, which meant that also British banks could extend credit to the Americans.
Okay.
Super important. No Latin American country that fought for its independence against Spain was recognized by Spain as legitimately independent, and therefore they couldn't get credit.
Okay.
So when we talk about banana republics, right, it starts right there at the beginning. If you don't get recognition at the end of your war for independence, you can't get national credit. So that's super important. So he's he's this interesting character who's not part of George Washington's inner circle of military friends, right? He's the diplomatic wing, and he's been abroad this entire time. But he comes home, and I think that it's very important for us to realize the extent to which this little republic on the eastern seaboard of this great continent was a fragile operation, and that Great Britain remained, even though we had defeated them in our war for independence, they remained the largest naval commercial empire on planet Earth, and that whoever had been ambassador to Great Britain or had dealt with the British, right, had a very important place in the American government. And so for George Washington not to have Alexander Hamilton as his vice president, but to have somebody who had actually experience in diplomatic affairs, right? For a new tiny little country, experience in diplomatic affairs is really important, and George Washington didn't have that.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. And so he picks John Adams. Now he becomes the vice president in the United States under George Washington. It would be fun to... Did they actually have cabinet meetings where you had Adams and Jefferson and Hamilton and Washington like in a room, or
together?
They
Certainly,
did? Yeah,
certainly. And I think that it is important for Adams to really think of him as the well-rounded man, right? That he's a founder, right? He's involved in the Declaration of Independence and the war for independence on the diplomatic side of things. Then he's president, right? And then we have his life in retirement and his role as a family man and as a friend, right? So there's a lot to learn from a biography of John Adams, right? In many different ways. But I think keeping in mind that before he's president, he's one of the founders, right? And so before we move into the presidency, I want to also point to two very substantial writings of John Adams that sometimes we forget. His Defense of the Constitutions and his Discourses on Davila. The Defense of the Constitutions is this extraordinary, there's almost, I don't know, nowadays we probably would have said that the Adamses were on the spectrum. That they're very obsessive, right? And so the Defense of the Constitutions is an obsessive dive into everything that ancient philosophers and ancient historians and Renaissance philosophers and Renaissance historians have said about republics, whether it's democratic republics, aristocratic republics, or monarchical republics, right, through the ages, right? It's a 3-volume work. He just wrote endlessly about every kind of republic in history. And he's sending this back to James Madison from abroad during the Constitutional Convention. So even though he and Thomas Jefferson were not present during the Constitutional Convention, they nevertheless were writing voluminously to James Madison. Right.
History is every constitution known to man. Maybe this will help.
Maybe this would help. This is how the Swiss did it. Right? This is how the Venetians did it. Right. I mean, he's looking at it. This is how Athens did it. Right.
Wow.
So he's going through his, what we used to call in the olden days before the internet, right? His Rolodex of republics, right? And, what are the proper checks and balances? What are the proper separation of powers, in order to get the mix right? And he has a section on Solon and the Greeks and a section on Montesquieu. And, so that's a really substantial contribution to the American founding. Discourses on Davila is also, I would say, a kind of work of an angry blogger dude who does not want people to confuse the American Revolution with the French Revolution.
Got it.
And wants to distance the American sort of covenantal or kind of conservative social contract, view to be confused with Rousseau's social contract. And so it's a kind of long screed against Rousseau. And really at the heart of it, is a theism. I mean, he says in Discourses on Davila, it's a kind of famous quotation from that text, that if you ask me to believe that there's no father of the universe, right, that all of this, he says, is without a father, He says, next thing you know, you'll be asking me to believe all sorts of nonsense, right? And that you can't found a community on a sense of that all of this is made by chance and that there is no order in the cosmos. And so, it really is a kind of screed, like an angry blogger dude's screed against atheistic republicanism that he thinks just will not work, right? So Russell Kirk, in his book, Roots of the American Order, spends a good deal of time on both of those books by John Adams, Defense of the Constitutions and Discourses on Davila. And I think it's a really sort of substantial intellectual history of John Adams, right? Not just what he did, but also the thinking behind what he did. Sometimes you have other biographies. I mean, the David McCullough biography is wonderful, and of course the mini series. But Russell Kirk's chapter on John Adams really contributes an intellectual portrait of John Adams that you don't always get if you're just looking at his activity as diplomat or his activity as president, right? But to see him also as a thinker, right?
And what was the role of a vice president at this point? What was he doing? What was in his portfolio?
It was pretty limited, and he was very frustrated. He was very frustrated with the role of vice president, and saw himself as too much in the shadow of George Washington. I think that the Adamses are always the diplomatic line of American history, whether it's John Adams negotiating the Treaty of Paris in 1783, or John Quincy Adams negotiating the end of the War of 1812, Charles Francis Adams, who is Lincoln's ambassador to Great Britain during the Civil War, and then Henry Adams, we can talk about later. They are all the diplomatic wing. They're looking at American foreign policy, and they're always a little bit jealous of the military lineage, right? So the General George Washington, General Andrew Jackson, General Ulysses S. Grant, General Eisenhower, right? And they just don't have a lot of respect for, just the general's mind who doesn't understand foreign policy.
Sure.
And so they always think that they should have, more of a role than they do. So the vice presidential relationship of George Washington and John Adams, there's a lot of wishing he had more say in John Adams. But he was more of a Federalist and on the side of Alexander Hamilton and George Washington in terms of their fiscal policy and the Treasury, the Jay Treaty, than Thomas Jefferson, who gradually became more enamored of the French Revolution and even wanting America to enter the Napoleonic Wars. Well, they weren't Napoleonic Wars yet, but the French Revolutionary Wars on the side of France. And so Washington, Hamilton, and John Adams are pushing back against any engagement in a European war. They're like, that's nice that they were our ally during the American Revolution, but we don't have to take their side now that they're attacking, every European power. Let's not get involved, So he is definitely more on that side of the cabinet. Right.
And then he becomes president after 8 years of being vice president. He is a one-term president, just like his son. So what's going on in that period? Was it clear that Adams was the successor to Washington, or was it up in the air?
So this is good for Americans to remember, is that American elections became acrimonious very quickly. Right. And so as soon as there was that divide between the Anglophile John Adams and the Francophile Thomas Jefferson, and a division over our foreign policy and what wars we should get involved in or should stay out of, and who we should have more financial dealings with, politics becomes very acrimonious. And so the tension between John Adams and Thomas Jefferson dates from the time of Washington's presidency. It lasts through John Adams's presidency, and then on to the 1800 election between Jefferson and Adams. So a lot of what they're fighting over is foreign agents coming over and influencing American foreign policy. So it's actually a lot of what we would talk about in terms of shaping public opinion, freedom of speech, but at the same time not leaving your public forum open to being subverted by a foreign power.
Yeah.
And so, of course, the Alien and Sedition Acts are usually seen as this egregious, destruction of American freedom of speech. At least that's how it's portrayed by the Jeffersonians, right? But Adams was very concerned that you had paid agents of the French who were trying to shift American public opinion in favor of entering the war with the French, which they thought was not in our national interest at all. So those are the tensions that are going on there. We're still very much a provincial nation, very concerned about how it would affect us to be involved in the world wars between Britain and France.
Yeah.
Right.
And were the Alien and Sedition Acts, you could debate the merit or not of them, were they effective at accomplishing the goal, or was it a counterproductive measure that just stirred up ammunition for the opposition?
I think it did stir up ammunition for the opposition, and partially led to Jefferson's. He definitely used that in his electoral campaign against John Adams. Yeah.
Okay.
So perhaps more effective as a president, what John Adams managed to accomplish was his 3-point shot at the end of his presidency, which was appointing John Marshall to the United States Supreme Court.
Okay.
And so it's this wonderful moment where the president can have a lasting effect on the American regime through his judicial appointments, right? And this is kind of wonderful to see John Adams, who's thinking constitutionally about the role of the judiciary and the independent judiciary back with the Boston Massacre. And here he is right at the very end of his presidency, and his last legacy to America is establishing, a strong judicial appointment who's going to go on to give us judicial review and keep the independence of the court, right? And so, he sort of defeated Jefferson in advance.
In the long term. Yeah. So what, beyond, judicial review and the independence of the court, what are the other hallmarks of Marshall's court?
I'd say a greater stability of property.
Okay.
And stability of contracts, that you had to respect, that the state had to respect private contracts, and that they couldn't, ignore private contracts and confiscate property for public use. So it really did give a kind of stability to the American economic system.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then during his presidency, was he gone a lot? Did he go back to the farm for a fair amount of time?
So John Adams and Abigail Adams are the first ones to live in the White House.
Okay.
Because Washington was inaugurated in New York for his first term in office, and then he was living in Philadelphia. But they built the White House, and John and Abigail Adams found Washington, D.C. to be just an abysmal place.
Okay.
Right? It had just been dragged out of the swamp and turned into a capital, and they didn't think that anyone should have, built a city in such a swampy, malaria-ridden, hot, humid, as Washington, D.C. still is, right?
To this day.
But they tried to turn the White House into a civilized place.
Okay.
So they were together during that period, which is a little bit sad for us historians, because it means that we don't have any John and Abigail Adams correspondence from the presidency years, because they were actually together.
Okay.
So just as we don't have any correspondence between Martha Washington and George Washington, even though they were apart for a long time, because Martha Washington burned all of her personal correspondence with George Washington. So, which, historians are they have meltdowns when they imagine Martha Washington, tossing into the fire all of her personal correspondence to George Washington, which would have given us a much more intimate portrait.
Oh, yeah.
But we do have a treasury of letters that give us a first couple in John Adams and Abigail Adams, but not from the White House years.
Okay. And then, so he runs for president again and loses. What are the main reasons that Jefferson is triumphant?
I mean, Jefferson is a populist. It's interesting because in many ways he's he is more aristocratic. He's, the slaveholding plantation elite, more enamored of, the French Revolution, the philosophes. He's a great theorist of the importance of having like the solid yeoman farmer at the center of the American Republic, but he himself is not that, right? He never really achieves the virtues of industry and frugality, which would have enabled him to get out of tobacco, get out of debt, free his slaves, right, in the way that George Washington did. George Washington diversified his crops and went into lumber and fisheries and cattle and got out of tobacco so he could get out of debt so he could free his slaves at his death. But Thomas Jefferson never managed that. So although he idealizes this like solid, sturdy, independent yeoman farmer, right, that's not what he is. And that is what John Adams is. Like literally that is what John Adams is. But John Adams doesn't idealize that as much, right? And talks about a natural aristocracy. And so this kind of carries over into later, after Jefferson's retirement, after 2 terms in office, the long-standing correspondence that we have between Jefferson and Adams. We have an abundance of letters, and a lot of those letters are about this question of a natural aristocracy. Right? If you have an intact family and you have property handed down from one generation to another, and so they're able to go to university and receive this education, and they have certain gifts and talents, then how is that not a natural aristocracy? This is, John Adams says it's almost impossible to prevent aristocracy from naturally occurring, that certain people, as he says, if you can get one man's vote besides your own, you're an aristocrat. But if there's 5 guys in a room and you have a vote and everyone votes for themselves, right? There's no one has come to the fore, right? As soon as you've gotten your vote and one other person's vote, you're the aristocrat in the room. They've acknowledged that you're taller, smarter, stronger, or, better prepared for the position, right? So John Adams talks like an aristocrat, even though he is a sturdy yeoman farmer at heart. And Jefferson talks about the importance of the people and democracy when in fact, that's not
he's
who he
an
is.
aristocrat.
It's very paradoxical.
So they had this correspondence, these letters. Was Adams more supportive of Jefferson as a president in terms of his accomplishments, or was he still skeptical? He was still skeptical.
They did not correspond during Jefferson's presidency. It was only in retirement that they patched up their relationship. And even so, I was a little bit surprised when I picked up my nice little volume of Jefferson and Adams letters and looked at the table of contents. Adams wrote every month and Jefferson responded once a year.
Oh, okay.
It was not an equal.
So he's one of those friends.
It was not an equal correspondence by any means. Right.
Fascinating. What else besides the point of the natural aristocracy jumps out in their correspondence with each other?
They actually do discuss the role of religion in creating a healthy public. And Jefferson by that point is, early Jefferson is not an unbeliever at the time of the American founding. But later Jefferson, has much more imbibed, the sort of French atheistic spirit and is very dismissive of the need for religion. And Adams, who himself is not a devout Christian, right? I wouldn't say. I think Abigail Adams is a devout Christian, but is nevertheless just as adamant as George Washington is that you can't have a virtuous and moral republic without the presence of public religion, public support for religious practice and the acknowledgement of the blessings of God, right, and also the punishments of God on people.
So before we move to John Quincy Adams, Abigail Adams, we've talked about her a little bit. What role, kind of looking back, do you see her having played in the American founding more broadly? Yeah.
So John and Abigail Adams's letters are published by their grandson, Charles Francis Adams, in the 1840s during the period of Jacksonian democracy. So a little bit later, looking back, right, and kind of giving to us a first couple, right, the solidity of this first couple. during the period of Jacksonian democracy. So most of their letters weren't published during, they were their private correspondence at the, during the founding, during the presidency years. They weren't available for people. But what you do see, so in that sense, Abigail was a retiring first lady. She was not an activist first lady who was taking part in the Continental Congress and the Declaration of Independence, or they are corresponding, right? But she's not an activist. Really, I would say she has a kind of emotional independence and stability that enables John Adams to pursue his public career in an extraordinary way. I mean, during the American Revolution, perhaps one of the most moving parts of their letters is when she goes through the death of her mother and the death of a little daughter of hers within weeks. And it's at a time when her correspondence with John Adams, it takes a long time for letters to get from the Boston area down.
The death of her mother and the death of who else?
Her daughter.
Her daughter. So Adams is gone. John is gone while his daughter dies.
Exactly.
Wow.
Right. And she does kind of, she tells him, you did say you would be home if certain things occurred. She's very discreet about it, even in a personal letter, right?
Yeah.
Kind of like, you had told me that, if I was expecting, you would be home, and you're not, So she does occasionally kind of stand up for herself, her rights in the relationship. But he is, John Adams is just overwhelming in his praise of her strength in handling that in his absence.
Okay.
But what's hard to see is her letters informing him of her mother's death, or her letters informing him of her daughter's death, and his letters of support are sort of crossing paths and not quite.
Okay.
It's hard to have a conversation. Right?
Sure.
This is not immediate texts, and you get like an emoji heart face back immediately to kind of as a salve for the wounded soul. So it's hard to read, it's hard to watch, but he is all admiration for her strength in going through what she's going through. The other thing that you see is those Puritan virtues of industry and frugality. That she keeps that farm going, right? The entire time that he's away, she has to deal with the workers. She has to deal with scarcity. She has to deal with the question of whether to take out food on credit for their family. And he gets very upset when he finds out that she's taken out credit on his name.
Okay.
And so there's a back and forth on that, and this is when she starts using the pen name Portia, which is the wife of Brutus.
Okay.
And so basically she's saying, just as Brutus could trust his wife Portia and tell her what his concerns are in public, because she was willing to wound herself in the leg to show that she was as strong as a man, and couldn't be broken under torture. So she starts using Portia.
Okay.
He's saying, my dearest friend. And she's saying, you're loving Portia. And finally he says, yo, Portia, no more credit on my name. Okay?
Yeah.
It's the first time that he uses the name back to her, is to kind of call her to a level of virtue as well, which is it's amusing. It's a great relationship to witness.
Yeah. So in raising John Quincy Adams, so they had a shared kind of opinion that this life of kind of public service would be instilled in John Quincy from a young age. So that was...
Which is an amazing vision, really, for people who are farmers in a log cabin, and seeing their son as possibly this, ambassador to the court of St. James, ambassador to the court of the Tsar, ambassador to the court in Madrid, right, to the King of Prussia, right? How did they have that vision? And I really think that it was their classical education, that they saw themselves as having a destiny, having a mission of taking care of this republic. And they didn't deprecate their own gifts, their own talents, or the gifts and talents of their son. They recognized in John Quincy Adams very early on that he was precocious, he was gifted, and that he could contribute a lot. I do think that that little episode of sending Charles home because Charles can't take it away. There's a leitmotif in the story of the Adams family of the difficulty that children have in being educated far from their mothers. And in every generation of the Adams family, while there is one outstanding son who sort of stands by their father as stalwart of public life, the other sons do tend to sort of drink themselves into misery and debt and disaster. So there is a lot of conversation in each generation about the effect of being raised near the father, and the effect of being raised without the mother's presence, and what that does to solidify the emotional and psychological constitution of the child. I'm reminded of this wonderful book called The Faith of the Fatherless, by Paul Vitz, who's a Christian psychologist, very good. And it talks about how being raised without a father, even if it's, just for, is nobody's fault or whatever, is a kind of precursor to depression, to drink, to atheism, to a kind of embittered view of the world, right? Whereas growing up with that, the immense confidence that you receive from both the presence of a mother and the presence of a father just sort of solidifies the psychological constitution, and that this is even more important for children who are intellectually precocious. And so sometimes we think like, oh, someone has intellectual gifts or special, that push them, right? But that you need to strengthen their emotional, their moral, their psychological constitution just as much as you need to foster their special talents and gifts. I think that's a leitmotif in the Adams family.
Interesting. So, I mean, one thing, I guess, as you look throughout history, maybe this is overly simplistic, but there's kind of the question of whether or not, a great man can have great children. You know what I mean? Or are they always, and even if you go like all the way back to Cyrus the Great, he allegedly does such a good job building this empire and instills these principles of education and blah, blah, blah. And then all of a sudden, it's like the moment that he dies, everything just goes to hell and the kids start fighting each other, and this just happens over and over again, Do you think that's often primarily because of the extended periods of absence from the father?
I do think so, that presence of the father. It's interesting that John Adams talks about how you can't have a solid and stable republic without a sense that there's a father of the cosmos, a great parent of the universe, right? But then how important the presence of the father in the household is, even for the stability of that little household, right? Isn't as apparent to him, right? But nevertheless, the Adamses do a great job from generation to generation. They're the only one of the American founders, right, where you have that kind of lineage of public service through 5 generations, really, because even though we can, we look at the famous Adamses, John Adams, John Quincy Adams, Charles Francis Adams, Henry Adams. Well, there's also a John Quincy Adams II and a Charles Francis Adams Jr. And, they're working with Eisenhower, they're Navy men, they're public figures, they're monuments men during World War II. So the lineage, hasn't died out just because it's not as famous. So they do a remarkable job, and they're always involved in the school, right? They're always involved in the corporation of Harvard, trustees of Harvard, teaching at Harvard. John Quincy Adams, when he's not being ambassador to Great Britain, ambassador to Prussia, ambassador to St. Petersburg, he's teaching classical rhetoric and Greek and Latin at Harvard, right? His go-to job when he's not in public office, right, is teaching at Harvard. So they always maintain that connection with the school.
And then in terms of John Quincy's his own education, was he just essentially homeschooled by Abigail? How much did John Adams play in selecting what books he should read? What did that look like?
Yes, Abigail was a homeschooling mother. She
Okay.
was well educated by taking advantage of her brother's tutor. So she was sort of unusually well educated for a woman of her time.
Okay.
And so it is essentially a homeschool education until Harvard, right?
Okay.
Yeah.
And he's reading what? Plutarch's Lives, Cicero, kind of what you would expect at the time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Sort of the canon. I notice here you have sort of
That's right.
the Harvard great books, right? And of course, this is instituted later at the beginning of the 20th century. He would have been reading them not in English translation, but in the original.
Sure.
Very widely read. And John Adams knew many languages. So he was a bit of a linguistic prodigy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So then John Quincy Adams, he has a very successful diplomatic career. He's Secretary of State, develops the acquisition of Florida, the Monroe Doctrine, a lot of this comes from him. And then he's a one-term president, right? So
Yes.
Here you again see this element where the Adams are great at the diplomacy, but maybe not as great as being the kind of the guy on top.
So in almost every American history textbook, they'll tell you, right, you have to tell the story of General Andrew Jackson and the Battle of New Orleans. And then they'll say, well, actually, the Battle of New Orleans took place after they had already declared peace with Great Britain, but the news hadn't reached New Orleans, a long time across the Atlantic back then, a month or two. And so maybe it wasn't the most important battle that solidified the war, but all of the popular military songs are about the Battle of New Orleans and chasing away the British, with the cannons. John Quincy Adams is the one who negotiates the Treaty of Ghent and really achieves an amazing diplomatic victory, which is basically status quo ante, right? We give up nothing and you gain nothing from the war. And that is actually the last time we go to war with Great Britain. And he has achieved, I think John Adams and John Quincy Adams achieved and then Charles Francis Adams in the American Revolution, keeping the British out of the American Civil War and, helping to prevent them from coming in on the side of the Confederacy. 3 Adamses in a row laid the foundation for the Anglo-American special friendship in the 20th century.
Okay. Because
getting Great Britain in the Treaty of Paris to acknowledge our independence and allow us, credit, then ending the War of 1812 in a way that prevented acrimony, right? If we didn't gain anything from Great Britain, they wouldn't fight us again in a war 10 years later to get it back, right? But then on the other hand, we didn't concede anything to them, so we're not bitter, wanting to go to war with them to get it back, right? So that was a kind of extraordinary achievement but then to go back, so John Quincy Adams and this diplomatic line is doing very well in maintaining our independence against the largest naval commercial empire on earth. And the glory for the victory goes to the general in the field. Yeah. Right. And this is what they kind of it's the same
haunting
thing.
them.
And, it's haunting them.
Okay. So then he's defeated by Jackson after the end of his first term. What year is that?
That's 1828.
1828. Okay.
But he still has a good 20 years of life in him after that.
Yeah, he does something remarkable by today's standards.
Right. He goes into the House of Representatives.
Okay.
Right. I mean, House of Representatives are not even as important as senators, right?
Yeah.
I mean, he is just, he goes back to play this role. And for 20 years, he is adamantly outspoken on the issue of slavery.
Okay.
And the gag rule and the refusal of Congress to accept petitions on the issue of slavery. From Northern abolitionists. And he is so adamant about bringing this up, right, that his wife, Louisa Catherine Adams, in some of her letters and diary entries, seems to say that if the American Republic descends into a civil war over the issue of slavery, that she would hold John Quincy Adams to blame for his adamance on the issue.
This is what his wife said. Yes. Well, okay.
Right.
And how many years before the Civil War did he die?
So he died in 1848.
Okay.
So if you think of the great compromisers, right? So it's sort of the generation of the senators.
Henry Clay.
Right?
Yeah.
Henry Clay, John C. Calhoun, Webster, the great compromisers in the Senate. And meanwhile, in the House of Representatives, right, you've got people like Lincoln and people like John Quincy Adams, who are, the Wilmot Proviso, the one issue voters, like no slavery, no extension of slavery to the westward, no slavery, no extension of slavery to the no federal funding for slavery, no federal funding for slavery, and they won't drop the issue. That's where John Quincy Adams is at the end of his life. Won't drop the issue of slavery. So I think it's actually a heroic post-presidency career. He's a bit of a bitter, angry blogger dude. Yeah. But it's on an issue that I think everyone today would look back and say it needed to be brought before the American public.
Sure.
Right. And of course, in the midst of all of that, he's also drawn into defending the slaves who rose up in revolt on the ship Amistad. Okay. Which is there's a wonderful movie made about John Quincy Adams' defense of the slaves. It's called Amistad, and he's played by Anthony Hopkins. And it's an excellent movie. It makes even better reading to read John Quincy Adams' own defense of the slaves. Okay. And so he's really active in the abolitionist movement. And then, the third generation. Right. You said that's Charles Francis Adams. Okay. So we can skip slightly over him, but we can't entirely because he is Lincoln's ambassador to Great Britain during the American Civil War. Okay. So when you have the Trent Affair, when you have the issue of the British building ships in the Liverpool harbor that could be released to the Confederacy and give the Confederacy a navy, which would have been disastrous. Yeah. Charles Francis Adams is in London that entire time trying to prevent the British from releasing those ships to the South. And he has at his side his son, not his oldest son, but his third son, Henry Adams. Okay. His two older sons, John and Charles, are both fighting at Antietam, at Fredericksburg. So they're actually on the ground in the battles of the Civil War. Henry Adams is, of course, taking part in the diplomatic battles of the Civil War. And that's his diplomatic training, right? So while they have two sons who are actually becoming military heroes, they've learned the lesson you can't do well in politics if you weren't part of the military. Right? Yeah. The third son is taking care of the diplomatic line. Okay. So we think of Henry Adams as the first generation not to be involved in public life. Actually, his two older brothers were. Okay. So he thought of himself as sometimes we refer to Charles and Henry, Prince William and Prince Harry, right? As the heir and the spare. Sure. Right? It's a little insulting to say that, but I guess Harry has claimed it for himself in his book. It's called The Spare, right? So Henry Adams considered himself the very spare because there was already a John Quincy Adams II and a Charles Francis Adams Jr. And so he was like, I can do whatever I want, right? I'm the spare of the spare, I think I'll study art history. It's sort of like every parent's, the kid who decides to study art, right?
So then why do we remember Henry but not he's the spare? So why not the others? Okay. Yeah. So, and I would say for two reasons. Okay. I mean, he's one reason is that he actually has a kind of secret diplomatic career of his own. Okay. So he decides when he's at Harvard that he doesn't want office. He says, I've never coveted any office that either you were elected to or appointed to. I've never wanted office. He says, I want power. Okay. Not office. Just want power. Like my forebears have not done well in office. They always get kicked out after one presidential term. And he says, how do you get power instead of office? He says, you become friends with someone who's in office. Mm-hmm. And then you become counselor to counselor to the king, counselor to the president, counselor to the secretary of state.
So he actually says at one point, of course, this is coming from somebody who's, Puritan/Unitarian. He says, the only office I've ever really coveted is that of cardinal. He's not Catholic, right? But he says, the only office I've ever coveted is that of cardinal. And what he means is cardinal, like Cardinal Richelieu.
Okay.
Kingmaker.
Yeah.
Like the power behind the throne.
Okay.
Right? So he wants to be the power behind the throne. So he becomes best friends with Lincoln's personal secretary, John Hay.
Okay.
Who goes on to become ambassador to Great Britain and Secretary of State. Precisely the two offices that all of the Adamses had always held, right? Those are the diplomatic offices that the Adamses wanted. But Henry Adams says, I didn't want office. I just became counselor to the man in office.
Yeah.
And so Henry Adams and John Hay are best friends throughout the entire Gilded Age period and up to World War I.
They met at Harvard. Or no?
They met in Washington, D.C. During the Civil War.
Got it.
And they actually build a duplex across the street from the White House, across Lafayette Square. It's now the Hay Adams Hotel.
Okay.
Right? So you can go and have tea where Henry Adams and John Hay would have discussed the affairs of state, across the street from the White House. They thought of themselves as much more important than the buffoons who were in the White House.
Okay.
They thought that McKinley, Teddy Roosevelt, and Taft were hopeless.
Really?
But that they had things under control and that they were rearranging American diplomatic relations, which had all been oriented towards defending America against Great Britain for 100 years, defending our independence from Great Britain, whether it was Revolutionary War, War of 1812, Civil War, keep the British out. But after 1870, the Franco-Prussian War, they recognized, the Adamses, with their knowledge of European history, recognized this is the rise of Germany. We need to ally ourselves with Britain against Germany. Okay. And so even though Britain has always been the enemy, right? The British are coming, right? Now we need this Anglo-American special diplomatic friendship. And so Henry Adams is not a nobody in American diplomatic history because he's very important for that relationship, which is so important for World War I, World War II, the Cold War. I'd like to tell my students that if you watch 007 movies and you're sort of on the side of 007 and MI6, but you're an American, you've come a long way since the British are coming. And the redcoats being the bad guys. And that's Henry Adams. Yeah. Like that's what he did to you, right? As he made you pro-British. Yeah. It is.
And so did he, you said they kind of thought of the presidents as buffoons, but presumably they had he was a frequent visitor. Right. And
how to be a counselor, right? To someone who you don't think is the wisest and most prudent, but the person who could win the election, right? And then you have to take the stuff of the kind of person who can win an election, right? With all of the lobbies and the democratic politicking, right? And then help them to understand the long-term diplomatic interests of the American people. Okay. The Adamses were always very concerned that we couldn't pursue a consistent diplomatic policy if you had this constant democratic overturn of the presidency, the executive branch. And so who would sort of maintain the ship of state, on the long term?
Now, is that something that he would have seen as a deficiency in the structure of our government, or would he have recognized any danger in, essentially to have a group of elites that are essentially steering the long-term foreign policy direction of the country, despite what the people might want?
So he does see it as trying to correct or remedy a deficiency in the regime. Okay. I think he, like John Quincy Adams, objected to the changes made in our regime in the Jacksonian period of Jacksonian democracy, much more democratic presidency, even more so the progressive era changes in our regime. And so he is very concerned with what will happen when, in some sense, even foreign policy is subject to the fickleness of a democratic, more purely democratic polity rather than mixed government, balanced Republican regime. So, for example, when, his worst case scenario, John Adams John Hay and Henry Adams's worst case scenario is that we will not support Britain when they go to war with Germany, as they see as inevitable that Germany will be an aggressor. And their worst case scenario is that Republican President Taft and Republican President Teddy Roosevelt run against each other and divide the Republican Party to such an extent that a Democrat, Woodrow Wilson, gets into the White House, and with a pacifist Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, and refuses to play a role in defending British interests and allows Germany to launch this destructive World War I, which destroys Europe. Really, so they're just aghast. Right?
Sure.
Henry Adams actually says, when he sees Taft starting to be elected, Taft, Titanic, Taft, Titanic, chaos, 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 chaos. Right? The whole thing's gonna go, right? Everything that we've tried to orchestrate to prevent Germany from being an aggressor in the 20th century.
So when Wilson runs for his second term, his slogan is like, he kept us out of the war.
Right.
Does Hay and Adams, I guess I don't know what year Adams dies, but do they have is it in part their sway that kind of pulls them over to the defense of the British?
So John Hay is dead by that point. Henry Adams is alive. Henry Adams really despises Woodrow Wilson. And mostly that's because he thinks that if he had been stronger in not sort of dabbling in peace initiatives and like internationalist rhetoric, that Germany never would have dared to invade France in the first place. So I think they saw their efforts as preemptive diplomatic efforts to prevent the war from ever happening.
Interesting.
Right?
Okay.
It's not that they wanted America to be in the war against Germany. They had been hoping that if there was a united Anglo-American front, Germany would never initiate war. So Henry Adams is still alive during the second term, but he thinks it's too late because at that point, even though America is coming into the war, Britain has lost. I say this actually, strangely enough, still with some emotion, because I've read all of this through Henry Adams's letters, is that by that time the Bolshevik Revolution has occurred and Great Britain has lost its ally in the East. And so there's no way to contain Germany without an ally in the East. And so it's not just World War I, but it's World War II. And Henry Adams writes very prophetically about the collapse of Europe. And that we expected Great Britain and Russia to contain Germany, and it was not something that was possible. We tried to stay out of it, but that exacerbated the problem of Germany.
And it's remarkable if you think of this, the sort of the sweep of Henry Adams' life. Okay, you're alive in the Civil War, and you're alive after World War I and the fall, the Bolshevik Revolution. I mean, radical different worlds.
It's extraordinary.
And so he wrote a history of, history of America in the early 19th century, but then he writes this book, The Education of Henry Adams.
Right.
So why is this book considered one of the greatest nonfiction books of the 20th century? Yeah.
It's an extraordinary book. So it's his memoirs. It's autobiographical memoirs, The Education of Henry Adams by Henry Adams. But it is a satire. So he's attempting something in the 20th century, which is a very 18th century genre, which is satire. And so the entire book, chapter after chapter, is a kind of argument that he had received no education. He got no education. Got no education, got no education, got no education, right? And everybody looks at this book and says, that's ridiculous. He had the finest education you could get in America at the time. And he says, no, I got an old fuddy-duddy education, which was the old Harvard liberal arts education. And you know what? You can't be successful in the modern world. You can't be a corrupt politician and get ahead with these old-fashioned virtues that I was given. I didn't have the education that would have enabled me to be a success.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's all very snide.
Yeah.
Right. He actually thinks that he got a wonderful education. But his education is constantly making him more and more tied to virtue and more wary of the lobbying and the democratic politicking and the kind of special pleading. And he's like, I got the wrong education for the 20th century. If you want to be a success in the 20th century, please don't go into the 20th century with old-fashioned notions of public virtues that you got from your great-grandfather, right? Drop those at the gate if you want to be a winner in the 20th century. So it's very dark and snide.
Okay.
So it's a master work of literature, but it's not easily readable.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So, reflecting back on this dynasty, which spanned, over a century, what are the lessons for today as we think about recovering statesmanship and in statecraft? If Henry Adams thought that his age, the corruptive aspects of democratic politics, the age of social media and sort of this mass democracy, what can the public virtue Adamses kind of teach us about how to respond to our moment?
Right. Well, I think the recovery of that form of education, and Henry Adams the education of Henry Adams is really like a cry of pain.
Okay.
That we think the Republic can be sustained by people who are not educated in that same tradition of virtue and moral philosophy that John Adams had from Cicero, right? It's this cry of pain that you think that if you're educated to make sure that the trains run on time, but not educated to ask where the trains are going and what's happening to the people at the end of the line, as we like to say about the Nazi regime in Germany, right? Yeah. If you're just a button pusher, right? If you only understand how to work the technology, but you don't ask important questions about the ends, the moral ends, that you're working for, that the Republic will decline and fall.
Yeah.
That's so the recovery of that education. And these are Harvard men, but they're aghast at what's happened to Harvard, right? They are appalled that Charles Eliot has gotten rid of the Latin and Greek requirements for getting into Harvard. They're appalled at the end of any kind of chapel requirement. They're appalled that the old traditions of Harvard, are not being continued and that it's become a vocational school. And in some sense, they see Wilson's School of Public Policy or whatever as being the vitiation of the reality of the moral education that used to be at the heart, right, of those schools, but that they've become, they've grown in their endowment size. They've grown in the number of schools and departments and faculty and students and, coeducational. They're just huge at this point. It's not Harvard College anymore. It's Harvard University, right? And Henry Adams says it's grown to dinosaur proportions.
Yeah.
The heart has gone out of it, right? The education that he remembers, the education in virtue, right? The education in piety to your grandfather, to your father, to your great grandfather, has gone out of that education and is no longer the heritage that we're passing on. Yeah. So I think recovery of that classical education is something that Henry Adams, Charles Francis Adams, John Quincy Adams, John Adams, would give to us as a legacy.
Great. Well, let's end there. Thanks so much, Susan.
Yes, you're very welcome.